Hi guys, and welcome back to my channel. The case that I'm going to be looking into today actually follows a serial killer from the 80s and 90s, and he is called the Gainesville Ripper. Have you ever heard of the Gainesville Ripper? I assume that you have. You know, if you've seen this case before, I'm sorry, it's a suggested case for me. I know it's been done a few times, but you know, I'll do all of the suggestions that you guys ask for, whether they've been done a million times or not. And some of my cases have been done a lot and others haven't, so it's kind of a nice mix of both, I guess. I actually found this case really interesting, and if you guys obviously haven't actually heard of it, hopefully you'll find it interesting too. There's a weird little thing that surrounds this case. Have you ever heard of the Scream movies? I assume many of you have. I absolutely loved them. But the killer in those movies, the ones with the ghost face mask, was actually based like loosely off the Gainesville Ripper. So he inspired films. This case was suggested by Ian, so thank you for that. I appreciate any suggestions you guys have. And if you have any more, please let me know. So let's go back to the 23rd of August in 1990, because this was when two roommates, Sonia Larson, who was 18, and Christina Powell, who was 17, were getting their dorm room ready. They were buying the last ditch things. You know, they went to Walmart, they bought a couple of items for their apartment. They wanted it to look nice and homely before they were starting their freshman year. Then they went home that night, and then after that, just everything went dark. Like, nobody heard anything off them. Nobody saw them around campus. You know, their family didn't hear anything off them. Their friends didn't hear anything off them. And I guess they thought that maybe, at least on the side of contact from family or friends who wasn't at the campus, figured that they were just busy. You know, they were just starting out. They just thought that they were too busy to answer, in a sense. Even though it was a bit abnormal, you know, they didn't really worry too much. Christina's parents were actually planning on going down to see her for a few days before her classes even began. And they had planned to go down on Sunday the 26th in the morning, and they decided that they were still going to go. You know, they'd already planned it. Yes, they hadn't heard anything of her, but they were still going to go. They still wanted to see their daughter. So off they go. They get to the apartment and they get no answer. Now, you may just think that she's out, you know, she's busy, she's out, whatever, but her car was still in the car park, and that really worried them. So they did call the police. The police came and they very quickly broke down the door, and what they found inside was just horrific. Both girls had been murdered. The scenes were just awful. They actually found Sonia first. She was laid naked on a bed and had been stabbed 20 times. It appeared as though her mouth at some point had been taped shut. She had like a sticky residue on it. So if you imagine putting duct tape on the mouth and then ripping it off, it leaves behind like the sticky, tapey bit of it. And although there was no duct tape on her face, you know, it gave the impression that there used to be at some point. Investigators assumed that she probably was asleep, well, you know, when she was attacked, like before it started kind of thing. She also had a lot of cuts on her arms and hands. She had lots of defensive wounds. She fought so fiercely, but unfortunately it wasn't enough. Her attacker managed to overpower her and eventually kill her. And it's actually believed that she did unfortunately die whilst trying to fend this person off. She was then dragged to the bottom of the bed and then posed in a horrible, sexually degrading way. The police then obviously went downstairs, and that is when they discovered Christina's body. It's assumed that throughout all of this she had been asleep on the sofa. Her attacker, once they'd finished with Sonia, came down and they taped her mouth up and her wrist behind her back. Most likely because Sonia really did fight back, and this person probably wasn't expecting that, or her to be so fierce with it. But like, who wouldn't be? At the end of the day, you're trying to fight for your own life. Who is not going to be fierce with that? But I believe that is why, like, he taped this one up, Christina's arms up, because he didn't want her to fight like that. So he taped them behind her back. He then threatened her with a knife and cut her clothes off. So she was already tied up and taped up, and then he cuts her clothes off around her. He didn't cut the clothes off first. He did it after she was tied up. She was then violently sexually assaulted, and then when the attacker was done, you know, he forced her head to the floor face down, and then he stabbed her 5 times in the back. Her body was posed in the same degrading way that Sonia was, like exactly the same pose. And he also removed her nipples and took them with him as like some sort of sick trophy, I guess. Well, It was actually later found out that before leaving, this killer, you know, he had some gals. He didn't just murder and run. No, he went and had a shower and, like, he ate a banana and then left the peel on the side for the for the police to find. He didn't just rush right out of there. Initially, it was kind of believed that it was a burglary gone wrong, but there was a lot of aspects that didn't tie in with that. For example, like the sexual assault, the sexually posing the body. It just didn't really tie in with a burglary. Normally, if you're trying to burgle someone and then you end up killing someone as a result because, I don't know, they've got in your way of the burglary, you don't sexually assault them and tie them up and pose them. It was like he was setting a scene, like a movie scene or something like that. So because of that, they began thinking that maybe this person was just killing for the sake of killing, like just picking anyone and then just murdering them. And that was very common. It's a very common trait of serial killers, of taking trophies and positioning bodies and things like that. So the police really began to worry that they could probably expect a lot more victims and that these could be the first of many. Then, only 8 hours after the first bodies were found, another teenager was reported as missing, 18-year-old Krista Hoyt. Now, Krista actually worked as a records clerk at a local police station as well as studying at college. On the night of Monday the 27th, she was due in work at midnight, so she was due in for a shift and she didn't turn up. And the people around her got really worried about that because that was really abnormal for her. She always came into work, and if not, told someone. And then that coupled with the 2 murders that had occurred, it just got her co-workers really worried, so they went to check on her. They go to her ground floor apartment, they knock on the door, and they receive no response. Eventually, somewhere along the line, they called officers, and officers attending the scene, and they go walking around the side of the building to try and see if they can see if anything looks amiss. And that is when they notice like this piece of fencing that was kind of dislodged and like bent over as if someone had trampled on it or something. And then in that area they noticed that Krista's sliding glass doors were slightly ajar and it looked like the lock had been tampered with. So she had Venetian blinds which just kind of hang straight down and they couldn't really see in, but on one corner of these Venetian blinds was raised a little bit, so an officer gets on his hands and knees and looks through. And that is when he saw Krista's body. She was naked and was slumped into a sitting position on the end of her bed, and even more gruesome, she had also been decapitated, which is just horrific. So this actually happened on Sunday the 25th of August. The killer breaks into her apartment by prying open the sliding glass doors with this knife called a car bar knife, along with a screwdriver, and he went in to find the home empty, so he decided to wait. At 11 a.m, she came back and he grabbed her from behind, surprising her. She didn't have a clue we were there. And then he got her in a chokehold. After he had incapacitated her, he tapes her mouth shut and her hands behind her back. She was then forced into the bedroom where he cut off her clothes once more, like with the other girls, and he sexually assaulted her. He then, once finished with her, forced her head down into the ground and stabbed her 1 time, rupturing her heart and killing her. Apparently, this is when the killer left the apartment. You know, they went off to do their thing, but would later return because he thought he'd lost his wallet and he thought he may have left it there. And obviously that is very incriminating evidence if he has. So he went back to the apartment to see whether his wallet was there. And that is when he decided to decapitate her, remove her nipples, which were found on the bed next to her. And then he put her into the sitting position. He took her head and put it on the bookshelf in front of where her body was sat. So it was like she was looking at herself, which is just so horrific to even think about and really freaky. Like really freaky. And it was done to add a shock factor to whoever discovered it. Whichever poor soul was the first one to discover this young teenager's body would have been probably scarred for life. And that is what he wanted to do. He wanted it to be a big shock. He set his scene. It's like something out of a film. It literally is. Like he was setting up all these like movie scenes to act out. Pathologists found out that Krista had actually been dead for around 2 days, like when the police found her. So it might have even been the same day that she was murdered as with the first 2, or just like a few hours into the next day kind of thing. By Monday the 27th, the news of these 3 murders was getting out. It was gaining widespread media attention, as you would think it would. There was a serial killer on the loose. And that is when they dubbed him the Gainesville Ripper. Many students were taking extra precautions. You know, they were doing things like changing up their daily routine so that whoever this person was couldn't guess where they were going to be or whatever. They ended up sleeping together in groups. But these people barely had any time to panic before he struck again. The very next morning, 2 more people were thought to be missing. Tracy Pauls, who was living with her roommate Manny Tabola, and they were both 23 years old. Now, they had been friends for a very long time. When they found out that they were going to go to the same school, university, college, whatever, they decided that they would live together, and so that is when they became roommates. Friends of theirs hadn't heard from them in a little while, and so with everything that was going on, they began to worry. They ended up asking the campus manager if they could get a key to their apartment, and he agreed, and they went down there together to see what was going on. They didn't have to look very far, because as soon as they opened that door, they find blood, and there's this black bin bag there too. So, you know, they run straight out of there and they call the police. When the police actually get there, they discover that the black bag is now gone. So, you know, he was probably still there. The killer was probably there when they came in. He was probably interrupted, and then when they left, he grabbed the incriminating evidence, the black bag, and he ran. Maybe out of a window, you know, just to flee, just to escape. So he was literally there, and they still didn't have it. Inside, they found Tracy's body lying in the hallway. As with the others, there was evidence that she had been bound, gagged. She had the telltale tape marks on her wrists and mouth, although, again, the killer takes the duct tape away with them, probably to avoid leaving any evidence behind. But this time, she hadn't actually been mutilated, and it really is thought that that was because he was interrupted. So probably he was going to mutilate her body, but didn't get the chance to because, you know, somebody rumbled him. Manny was also attacked in his sleep. The killer stabbed him several times all over his body, his legs, arms, torso, face, neck. He had slashes all over his arms and hands where he's trying to fight back and he's trying to defend himself. You know, after he'd probably woken up, was trying to fight this attacker off, and he just unfortunately couldn't. Evidence from the scene suggested that Manny was actually killed before Tracy was killed. So, on the 27th of August, the killer broke into their apartment, prying open the glass sliding doors with the same tools that he had been using previously. He came across Manny asleep in the bedroom, and after fighting with his victim and stabbing him numerous times, he eventually did kill him. Most likely after hearing all the noise and wondering what the heck was going on, Tracy goes to the bedroom to see what's what, and that is when she sees the killer, panics and runs out of there. She tries to barricade herself in a bedroom, but he just managed to break through the door. He then tapes up her mouth and her wrists, cut off her clothing and sexually assaulted her before turning her over and stabbing her 3 times in the back. Tracy's body was posed in a sexually demeaning way, but Manny's body was not. It was just left in the same position in which he had lost his life. And with all the similarities, yes, okay, there was some differences, like he took one set of nipples with him, but then left the other ones on the bed. And, you know, there was these weird little differences, but the similarities were, like, outstanding. And they really knew that this probably was all the same killer. These murders were really scaring the public, and so initially you assume, like, he has like a profile of the women that he was targeting. It was mainly petite Caucasian brunette with like brown eyes, and that was who he was targeting. But now with Manny's death, it was as if he would just like kill anyone, and so everyone was petrified. Before, they were kind of thinking that if they had, I don't know, blonde hair, green eyes, that they were safe. But now they're thinking, well, he's just killed a guy, so none of us are safe, pretty much. Also, Manny was 6 foot, like over 200 pounds. He was an athletic guy, and he still couldn't fight off his attacker, which really gave the impression to people, police, that this killer knew what he was doing. So we now have 5 murders within the space of 3 days, and then it suddenly all stops. This gave police a chance to finally fully look into the murders. So far, they've just been getting body after body after body, and they're working on the evidence on the first bodies, and then another body comes in, and then they got that to deal with. So they're dealing with all this evidence, and they didn't really have much time to do it. But now that the bodies have stopped dropping, thankfully, they could concentrate on more like trying to catch this person. They began looking for similarities between the girls. Obviously, I've already said their appearance, so he had like a specific type of person that he was looking for. But then they found out that they all had these sliding glass doors, and that their gardens kind of went out with forest surrounding it or something like that, something really, really secluded, and it's believed that this person stalked them from that forest. Shut up! They were obviously all attacked, they were all duct taped and then stabbed, with the duct tape being removed in case that it like left any evidence behind. The girls' bras were always ripped off instead of being cut off. Like, he cut off their clothes, but yet the bras he literally tore off. And it is also thought that the killer probably used gloves whilst doing these attacks. Police searched local rivers, they searched bins, they searched everywhere to try and find any bit of evidence that maybe the killer had thrown away. Maybe they, you know, they would come across something, but they didn't. They were hoping maybe they'd find a piece of duct tape or something, some gloves, but there was just nothing. They literally found nothing. And the people of Gainesville were panicking. Literally, the gun store had sold out of all of its guns. Even in the closest towns, all the guns were gone. Mace, bats, anything, literally anything that you could defend yourself with was all sold out. It were all gone. It was crazy, and yet I can't follow them. Like, if they have the option to be able to defend themselves in that way, then they're gonna take it. They were terrified that they may be next. So the police come up with a suspect profile for the Gainesville Ripper. They had a male in his late 20s to early 30s with a strong athletic build. He was probably single, possibly a loner, but was very organized and had a good extent of knowledge on how the police were. They believe that he probably did have some sort of criminal past, and that he was very confident and had this like good self-image of himself, but a very poor image of women. That he probably put no value on women whatsoever. Yes, okay, these profiles aren't fully accurate all the time, but you know, it gave them an insight as to what, you know, the personality of the guy that they were looking for could be. During this entire time, they're waiting on DNA testing to come back, which back in the 90s took quite a few days. It was all fairly new with what they were working with around that time, and so there wasn't a lot of faith in it. Eventually, it did finally come back, and the DNA found on Krista Powell's underwear, along with this paper towel that they had found by her body, both tested positive for semen, along with a sample taken from Krista Hoyt's body, and these samples were all from the same person, so that just confirmed that these murders had been done by that same person. Even though the police already thought that, they already have had that inkling because everything was so similar, but it was now confirmed that they for sure had a serial killer on their hands. They created a list of 675 men in Gainesville, and that was their suspect list, like their pool of suspects, which was quite big. They put together this team that was tasked with contacting every single person on that list, and they were told to like interview them and ask them for permission to get samples of their DNA. There was a lot of suspicion surrounding this one guy. He was called Edward Humphreys, and he was 18 years old. He had these odd small links that could be tied in with the case. So he had lived in the same complex as Tracy. He always carried a knife and often wore combat gear. And he was also well known to be a loner. On the 30th of August, just 3 days after the last murder, Edward Humphreys was arrested and charged with aggravated assault against his own grandmother. He was immediately taken to this mental health facility where he was assessed. And from there, he was actually diagnosed with bipolar or manic depression as it was known back then. The police questioned him, and seemingly he knew quite a bit about like the murders and stuff. And Edward's bail was set for $1 million, which is kind of insane for an aggravated assault charge. Like, that is way over the odds. And so the public began to think that they had actually caught the Gainesville Ripper because the bail was set so high. They searched his apartment. He had lots of knives. He had lots of screwdrivers. But when they tested them against the marks left behind by the killer's tools, they didn't match. They sent off DNA, saliva, all for testing, and because of limitations back then, you know, it would take quite a while. But when they eventually did come back, they proved that Edward wasn't this guy, and so he was cleared. Police began to look into the system to see whether they had come across any similar crimes, you know, in the US, and I believe it brought up 8 of them. Out of all of those 8, one of them was very, very similar to the Gainesville Ripper's killings and how he did things. It was this unsolved triple homicide from Shreveport in Louisiana on the 4th of November in 1989. So this was less than a year before like the first killings. 24-year-old Julie Grissom, her father, 55-year-old William Grissom, and her 8-year-old nephew Sean were all preparing dinner at home that evening, and then somebody actually broke into their house and literally stabbed them all to death using the same knife that the Gainesville Ripper used. It was very clear that Julie was the killer's main target. She was 24 years old, she was a petite brunette, and afterwards her body was mutilated, cleaned and posed. Whereas her father and nephew just seemed to be killed just because they were kind of in the wrong place at the wrong time. Don Means, an investigator in the case, actually went and travelled to Shreveport because of the similarities between the 2 cases that they were looking into, and they tested bodily fluids from the perpetrator in Shreveport, and they found that this person had the blood type B. Shortly after that trip to Shreveport, a woman called Cindy Jurashish, I apologise, I have no idea how to pronounce that name, but she called Crime Stoppers and she reported a man that was possibly connected to the murders. This man was 37-year-old Danny Rowling. He had a lengthy criminal history since he was very young, and he had been killing animals. He was looking in young girls' windows from a very young, which did eventually lead to more serious crimes such as theft and armed robberies. With his history of unsolved robberies, they started looking into, you know, any armed robberies in the Gainesville area. Around about the time of the murder, they actually found an unsolved robbery, an armed robbery of a bank in Gainesville on the exact same day that Krista Hoyt's body was found. The police at the time of the robbery happening chased two suspects into like the woods. One of them was a black male and the other was a white male. The black male ended up like stopping and giving himself up, whereas the white male fled into the woods. They did give chase, but they eventually lost him. Now, a little later on, they did come across a campsite that they believed that this male was using. And so they packed everything up as evidence and then they took it into the station. His accomplice, I'm not sure what he was called, but the one that was actually caught named, you know, the guy that ran off into the woods as a guy called Michael Kennedy. The police were now thinking that Michael Kennedy may have actually been Danny Rowling. The stuff at the camp that they took into evidence was never really looked into further, so they took it into evidence and they didn't do much about it after that. So the police began to look into that side of it to see whether any of this evidence could be tied in with the murders. And boy oh boy did they find some stuff. These were the items they found. A ski mask, which when tested matched fibres found on a tiny little piece of tape found at the third murder scene. On a pair of pants found in one of the bags, there was this tiny splash of blood, which matched to one of the murder victims. Screwdriver found at the campsite matched the markings on the sliding doors. So again, they leave like a indentation, a unique indentation apparently, which I never knew. And they matched. One of Krista Hoyt's pubic hairs was found in a sleeping bag, and there was more. They also found this tape recording that was from Danny himself, and it was a message to his mother and brother.
I know I'll have to run the rest of my life, but I'm getting pretty good at it. So I don't want you feeling sorry for me. I don't want you worrying about me. I'm a big boy. I'll take care of myself. We're all down here for just a breath anyway. Well, I'm gonna sign off for a little bit. I got something I gotta do.
We all know what those things that he gotta do were. When the police finally managed to track down Danny, it turned out that he was actually already in jail. He was being held for the robbery that police had caught him for, and so they decided that they were going to pay him a visit in relation to the Gainesville Ripper. He didn't admit to anything, he was very uncooperative, but he did let them take blood and DNA. They also took him to another room where they told him that they were going to need like 30 to 50 samples of his pubic hair to test, and he just pulls down his pants, grabs two fistfuls, rips them out, shoves them down on the table and says there ought to be 50 there. Like, just brazen. After a couple of weeks, the DNA finally came back and it was a match to all three crime scenes. So Danny Rowling was the Gainesville Ripper. And he was charged with 5 counts of first-degree murder, 3 counts of sexual battery, and 3 counts of armed burglary. But as I've already said, the DNA testing was relatively new at the time. It was a very new science and they didn't have much faith in it. Like, they didn't know that because it was so new, if you put that all to a jury solely off DNA, that they would convict him on it because it was so brand new. And so basically they wanted a confession out of him just to sort of put the last nail in the coffin kind of thing. Danny actually made a friend whilst he was in prison called Bobby Lewis, and he did eventually decide to confess to everything, but under one condition, and that one condition was that he didn't speak to the police at all. He spoke to Bobby Lewis, who then relayed it to the police. It was all very strange, but that's how he did it. It took a very long time, but eventually, you know, he did confess to everything. He said that he used a bike to travel around and about so that it was very quiet. He had seen his first 2 victims in Walmart when they were shopping for those last few finishing touches on their apartment. He thought that they were pretty and he followed them home. He said that he initially broke in on the ground floor through those sliding doors and that he saw Christina Powell asleep on the sofa. He said that he stood over, he watched her sleep, and then he decided that he was going to kill Sonia first. He admitted to all of the other murders, but he wouldn't speak about the Grissom family murders. He says that he would clear that up in due time. When asked about why he killed his victims, he said that he wanted to take another person's life for every year that he had served in jail for his armed robberies. which was 18 years in total. And so, you know, there could have been a lot more victims. It's so lucky that he was caught when he was, because he killed 5 people. Well, I don't know whether in that he's including the 3 from previous, but in that stint of a killing spree, he killed 5 people. Before that, he'd already killed 3, so that was 8. So there could have been potentially another like 10 victims on his hit list. In November 1991, Danny Rolling was charged and convicted with several counts of murder. He was brought to trial nearly 4 years after the murders, and he claimed that his motive was to become a superstar like Ted Bundy. In 1994, before his trial began, he unexpectedly pled guilty to everything, and on the 20th of April in 1994, he was sentenced to death. Shortly before he was executed in Florida for the Gainesville killings, he did finally claim responsibility for the Shreveport killings. And Danny Rolling was executed by lethal injection at Florida State Prison on the 25th of October in 2006. As I said at the beginning of the film, Danny inspired like things like Scream. He also inspired, you know, so many books, so many TV shows were made of him, documentaries. He's inspired quite a lot. So I guess partially he did kind of get what he wanted. I mean, he's no Ted Bundy and he's not that well known, but he did inspire a lot and is remembered for that. As sad as it is, like, and as unfortunate as it is. And my heart really goes out to all of those people involved, all of those young lives that were lost. And for what? Because he got caught doing armed burglaries and wanted to kill people for the years he'd spent in jail. It's just a tragic loss of young life. But yeah, that is the end of the case. If you guys have enjoyed, give me a big thumbs up. Thank you so much to the regulars, and if you are new here, consider subscribing. Anyway guys, that's all I have today on the case of the Gainesville Ripper, which was Danny Rolling. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, bye.